In this news roundup of a week on July the 15th, 2022, Russia turns off the gas supply and Europe's fear it won't be turned back on has far-reaching impacts. President Biden goes on to deal with people he labelled as pariahs, even as America's own bad behaviour is brought to attention. The UK Conservative Party fights like ferrets in a sack over who will be the next Prime Minister. And in this week's Short Thought, I dream of an end to safetyism in a country braced in terror over a coming heatwave. My name's Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. Europe's energy vulnerability gained a particularly sharp focus this week as Russia fully turned off the gas flow. That's actually not as dramatic as it sounds. It was the annual pre-planned interruption to supply on Nord Stream 1 so that maintenance work could take place. But now Europe's politicians, particularly those in Germany and several others particularly exposed, are left looking nervously on, pondering the possibility that the supply won't be switched back on again. A possibility given added currency because in previous years Russia had compensated for the switching off of Nord Stream by routing more gas via other routes. So far this year that hasn't happened at all. Right now Europe is sweating in the glare of a summer heatwave, but everyone's very aware that all too soon the next winter will arrive. Fears that deliveries through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline won't come back pushed the euro to a 20-year low against the US dollar this week. The impact on heavy industry energy users would be the most difficult, with suggestions that there'd be a sharp reduction in GDP across the Eurozone, with Germany the country hardest hit. A prediction given visual impact by this graph by Goldman Sachs, showing the different projections with and without a complete gas shutdown. Both Germany and France are preparing plans to trigger energy rationing that would restrict heavy industry activity. This has also applied particular pressure to Germany's coalition government, which has broken ranks over the current plans to decommission its remaining nuclear power plants at the end of the year. The Social Democrats of Chancellor Olaf Scholz and the Greens remain set on turning them off. The Liberal Free Democrats, however, have joined the Conservative opposition in calling for a delay. Christian Durr, head of the FDP group in Parliament, said, "Putin remains unpredictable. We should take precautions, stop generating electricity from gas, extend the life of nuclear power plants, and examine gas production in the North Sea." The call was presented as the pragmatic position and contrasted with what they said was the ideological stance of the Greens. You may recall that Germany already shut down 3 of its 6 remaining nuclear plants last year, so these would be the last ones to go. Although the discussion is presented in very simplistic terms, it's not the case, as is sometimes suggested, that it would make a huge difference if they kept them online. Only 16% of the Russian gas coming in is used for electricity generation. The bulk of it goes for process heat for industry and building heating. Nuclear power makes a difference to the electricity generation part, which is less of a problem, but it can't be used for heating, which is where the energy crisis will bite the most when there's a lack of Russian gas. Nevertheless, even if it will only make a small contribution, it does make some contribution, and you would think that the point where you're contemplating rationing energy, that would be the time when every contribution is embraced. Apologists for the policy cite bureaucratic obstacles, such as the length of time needed to carry out new safety inspections and to extend licences. Whether those arguments will cut through with the German population if it turns out to be a long, cold winter, that's an open question. Of course, side by side with an energy crisis comes a food crisis. Reportedly, 130 cargo ships are loaded up with Ukrainian grain, waiting in the Black Sea for the moment when they can get safe passage. It seems as though that moment may be a little closer, as Russia and Ukraine were said to by Turkey's government to have reached a basic technical agreement on how to move them out. Turkish Defence Minister Hulusi Akar said, "We see that the parties are willing to solve this problem." And he predicted that the final deal, to be coordinated with the United Nations, would see another meeting next week in Turkey that should sign off on the agreement. Ukrainian President Zelensky was more guarded, saying in his nightly address that he had been informed that there was some progress. It would be an important success if the breakthrough was to come, because right now a number of climate-related events mean that the world food system is seeing significant stress. Of the major bread baskets of the world, the USA, Argentina, the EU and Canada are all seeing some climate-related events that are depressing yields. In the US, a number of key growing regions such as Texas have had exceptional drought conditions for an extended period. Other areas such as Montana have seen floods. Argentina has seen reductions in wheat and soybean crops due to the ongoing drought there, which has lasted throughout the growing season. Mexico has seen its crops of corn, wheat and rice ravaged similarly by drought, forcing it to import more food at a time when the country has targeted achieving self-sufficiency. In addition to the crops, 1 million head of cattle are said to have died as a result of the drought. Europe is seeing reduced crop yields thanks to an intense heat wave that kicked off in June and has returned even stronger in July, particularly hitting hard in southern Europe. And China, which is generally tight-lipped about such things, has said that its harvest will be significantly affected. The actual wording was the worst in history by the floods last autumn and a current heat wave stoking fears for the next crop. This has also affected the pig industry there, the staple meat of the country, since soybean and corn are used as feed. India has seen its wheat crop depressed by the higher than usual temperatures that came earlier in the season, that has led it to impose a grain export ban. At least there's some better news from Brazil. Having been hit hard by drought last year, its corn production this year has recovered to record levels. Australia and Russia also have good forecasts for their harvests. And although some parts of the US and Canada have been hit, other parts are performing well. Which is the resiliency of the way the bread baskets usually work. Some will always be hit, but others will do better to hopefully offset those. It's just that one of the areas that had good climate conditions this year, Ukraine, has a depressed crop because of, all the bombs flying everywhere. And that's assuming that even what it has can be exported. The upshot of all that is that the total grains production worldwide is expected, according to the International Grains Council, to fall by 40 million tonnes to 2.251 billion in 2022-2023. It's actually a relatively small drop in absolute terms, but difficulties of moving grain to where it's actually needed means that the impacts will be a lot higher for more vulnerable countries, and everywhere will consequently be affected by higher prices. Just like there's plenty of natural gas and oil in the world, but also there are chronic shortages pushing up prices and creating a crisis. Which turns out to be a rather topical observation as US President Joe Biden headed off on a visit to Saudi Arabia. One of the things the war in Ukraine has done is to bring a certain pragmatic clarity to the basis on which governments conduct foreign affairs. Throughout history, it was always a hard-nosed business of pursuing the national self-interest, and that often meant treading through perilous grey areas to deal with people whose behaviours you would not want to condone. In recent decades, people started to think that maybe you could bring a higher moral tone to it all. British Foreign Secretary Robin Cook famously promised an ethical foreign policy, for instance. Well, that didn't happen, and Joe Biden came into office promising to make Saudi Arabia a world pariah for the state's killing of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Whatever were all his predecessors doing being nice to such a regime anyway, his supporters asked. Well, there's an answer to that. Dealing with the brutal realities of the global energy power balance. And here we are again. So this week, President Biden made his way to Saudi Arabia to try to patch things up and to encourage them to turn up the taps on the flow of oil to help the world's multiple crises. And plenty of the Western media, not all but plenty, have been very pragmatic about it, saying it was only being realistic to understand that the US-Saudi partnership had to continue in spite of that terrible and unfortunate incident. Like the Atlantic, for instance, which carried this "Biden is right about Saudi Arabia" piece, celebrating his realism. Weirdly, that's not what they said when Trump went to Saudi Arabia on pretty much the same basis. Then it was "the end of America lip service to human rights," and "for Trump, the truth about Jamal Khashoggi is beside the point," and "the brutal truth behind Trump's love affair with Saudi Arabia." There were plenty of other examples, but you get the general idea. The New York Times suggested that Biden had tried to isolate Mohammed bin Salman, but failed, which isn't exactly what happened. After he'd made the comment about making Saudi Arabia a pariah, he refused to sanction bin Salman, and he approved a sizable arms deal. In other words, he did what American leaders have always done: deal with the rest of the world on the basis of power relationships and self-interest. A reality that gets thrown into sharp relief when the old, relatively stable world order is visibly crumbling. But this week, the real question isn't about whether America has to deal with the brutal and unscrupulous in order to get a deal on energy. Really, it is just how brutal and unscrupulous has America itself been in recent decades. In an interview with Jake Tapper on CNN, John Bolton was pushed to speculate about whether Trump had been trying to bring about a coup d'etat on January the 6th. It had been suggested that Trump really didn't have the smarts to organise such a thing. A version which is at least congruent with the tell-all books about his time in office. Jake Tapper said, "One doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup." John Bolton replied, "I disagree with that, as somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here but other places. It takes a lot of work." Wait, what? I mean, it's not a surprise to me, and probably not to many watching this channel, that the US has done such things. I mean, it's documented extremely well further back in history. But is this something to be casually dropped into the conversation as a morally neutral thing to attribute to more recent administrations? I mean, which is more morally ambiguous? An autocratic state that disposes of a single journalist that they find irksome? Or a country that preaches the rule of law, organising an actual coup d'etat in another country in secret? Now, he quickly tried to defuse what he said, referring to Venezuela, saying that America really hadn't done much at all anyway, and he'd already written about it all in his book. But he didn't disagree when Tapper said that he thought there was more that he wasn't letting on. As you can imagine, didn't go down tremendously well in, well, several parts of the world. I mean, could he have given a bigger gift to Vladimir Putin to use in his whataboutism when it comes to Ukraine? And yes, Russia was quick to jump on it. The Russian Foreign Affairs Ministry called for an official investigation into the comments. It is important to know in which other countries the United States planned coup d'etat, they said, which is the first time the Russian state and I have agreed on much in 2022, as far as I can tell. And surprise, surprise, China was all over it as well. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin said this is no surprise. The admission simply shows that interfering in other countries' internal affairs and overthrowing their governments has become the standard practice of the US government. Evo Morales, ex-president of Bolivia, who was ousted from office in 2019 by a military coup, well, for some reason he wasn't happy. He said Bolton had showed that the United States was the worst enemy of democracy and life. A bit overstated, but even so. It's fair to note that some responded with derision to Bolton's claim of personal involvement in such things. A former CIA station chief, Milton Bearden, tweeted, "Bolton never touched a coup, and anyone who thinks fomenting coups is a good idea just doesn't get out enough." But the trouble is, it's believable because America has done such things in the past. And the point is that central to Putin's justification for invading Ukraine is that the world is still governed by pure power relationships, and different rules apply to sovereign nations, by which he means the great powers, than it does to the cannon fodder weaker powers around them. The West has said no to that, said we are now in a post-power politics rules-based world that has at least some principles, one being that you do not invade your neighbours with tanks and missiles to take them over. But the truth is that America is admitting, yeah, it's still based on power politics, except we have the power. And for everyone else, well, they can complain to the United Nations if they feel aggrieved. Now, it's not that simple. There is a lot more to it than that. But it's rather easy to miss any nuance if you're one of the countries that was targeted by the likes of John Bolton. I mean, it's not a great look, is it? America, a country that may or may not criticise you for human rights abuses, depending on how much it wants your oil. But also a country that may or may not help your military to overthrow your own government if it doesn't like how you're running things. And I say that knowing that some of the targets of that interference were appalling regimes. But, you know, anyone can call people names. Putin can call people Nazis. Does having a better evidence base mean that it's okay to take action on it? Well, who gets to decide? And on what basis? The answer is, as always, the people with the power get to decide. Well, okay, so long as we know what game we're playing. And it does seem that Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, the one thing they all agreed on, ultimately, behind the very different styles that they had, was the nature of the game they were playing. Does any of that provide cover to Russia for the invasion of Ukraine? Well, no, of course it doesn't. Not in my book. I would condemn such actions regardless of who did them. And they are in a different league. Russian forces have not just sought to overthrow a regime, they have slaughtered civilians. You don't have to be standing on an island of moral perfect purity to criticise that. But it's also good to note, dealing with Saudi Arabia is not the most morally dubious thing for which the US should be asked to account. In the UK, at least we know our leaders get held to account. Not for instigating coups, but for serious moral failings, like, you know, having parties and stuff. Hence, Boris Johnson is now languishing in regret. Meanwhile, the Conservative Party is in the midst of electing its new leader and the next Prime Minister of Great Britain. I don't get into the ins and outs of all the personalities and the egos and the backstabbing and all of that. It's rather like an American primary, where you all lash out at each other and damage each other's standing in the eyes of the public before finally putting one of those damaged candidates up as your consensus pick for the next election. And the fighting is certainly bloody and apparently calculated to come up with the least optimum outcome. But I will note one thing. The way they run their election makes it highly likely that the members of Parliament will ensure that the party membership do not get the opportunity to vote for the candidates they most like. So the way it's structured is like this. The MPs vote amongst all of the 8 candidates and the bottom 2 get struck out. Then they vote again and the next lowest one goes. That's where we are right now. The voting then continues until you get down just to the top 2. And then the full party membership gets to choose which one becomes leader. Why only 2? Why not 3? Why not all of them? Well, mostly because you don't want what happened with the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn, where a radical membership imposes a leader on the parliamentary party where there is almost no support for them as leader. But then everyone starts calculating and doing the maths, and here's how it's apparently going right now. Rishi Sunak is the candidate many MPs expect to win, and many are supporting him, no doubt because they think that's the best outcome. But others are supporting him, hoping that their support will mean a promotion into a government role for them once he gets elected. The party members mostly don't want Rishi, according to most polls. Doesn't really matter right now why that is. The party members do want either Penny Mordaunt or Kemi Badenoch, two rising stars who have some real appeal to the Tory base. Mordaunt is number 2 on the ballot. The polls of party members suggest she will beat Rishi Sunak hands down if it is the two of them. But the party's pro-Brexit right has a lot of weight here, and they want the former Foreign Secretary Liz Truss or Kemi Badenoch. Truss has more seniority and is currently placed 3rd on the ballot. The party members don't really want her either. She comes across as a more right-wing Theresa May, some real substance for sure, but a poor public speaker and campaigner. But the right think that when Kemi Badenoch gets eliminated, probably in 2 votes' time, all of her votes will go to Truss, which may give her a shot at being in the top 2. Here's the thing, Rishi Sunak's campaign believes that he might be able to beat Truss in a poll of the members more so than he could the others. So he may lend some of his supporters, so long as he has plenty to secure his own place, to ensure that Truss comes second. So the members end up with 2 candidates, neither of which they're excited by, and they then have to choose between them. All because the MPs are calculating and manipulating the process to try to increase their own chances by keeping the actual popular candidates out of the final 2. So glad I'm not involved still with party politics. Things like that just drive you crazy. Now, just because that's the plan doesn't mean that's how it's going to happen. Maybe Penny Mordaunt can manage some highly effective campaigning and pull more people onto her side. If Kemi Badenoch outshines Truss in the debates, as seems quite possible, maybe more of the right will swing behind her instead. We should know all of that by this time next week. I'm guessing we'll be able to contain our excitement until then. I'm sure that I can. The start of next week will be quite toasty, by all accounts. In the UK anyway, where we're told temperatures might hit a new high of 40 degrees Celsius. More likely it'll be around 35 degrees. It's fair to say it's generated a minor moral panic, as the airwaves are full of concerned-sounding people about how catastrophic this might be and how careful everyone needs to be. And of course they are, because the last time we got something really extreme was back in 1976. Since then, we've had this terrible pandemic running through the nation. I'm referring, of course, to the phenomenon of safetyism, for which there currently seems to be no known vaccine, although you can work at building your natural immunity, I would suggest. Can people suffer if temperatures get to 40 degrees C? Well, of course, especially in a country like the UK, which doesn't have a history of dealing with such temperatures, so has infrastructure and habits that are not aligned with them. Does it merit huge alarm? Well, no. It merits a bit of common sense advice, mobilising some preparations for infrastructure that's likely to be affected and for the people most at risk. Like most things that you fear the idea of, when the reality arrives, it's often a lot less worrying as you rise to the occasion to actually practically deal with it. Now, in saying that, I'm not lining up with the people who just shrug their shoulders and say, stop worrying, before then rushing off to do something ill-advised and reckless. But there's a big gap between that and the breathless worry that we've been seeing. As I said, the last time we hit a real high on the heat was the summer of 1976. That lasted significantly longer than this is expected to, a couple of weeks, and was thought to have been the cause of around a 20% uptick in excess deaths. A study of one geographical area found that it had mostly affected elderly people with cardiovascular or cerebrovascular disease. So, knowing that, some general advice on being sensible combined with action to support that specific subset of a community, that would seem to be appropriate. We have now entered a time, as I've said before here, of bigger history. The energy crisis in winter will present significant challenges. War and conflict is now our ongoing backdrop. I think it's time to adapt to the times, become a bit more stoical about the challenges, stop the daily panic sessions about every last trivial setback. We've been training people to be hypersensitive and fragile. We now need to train ourselves and others instead to be a bit more robust. And that could start with the sort of public messages that get sent out. I mean, look at COVID. When I argued, soon after the vaccines had been fully rolled out, that society should now open up, I was told by some how heartless and reckless I was in saying so because, well, you can always make an argument it puts somebody at risk. Well, today in the UK and in many parts of the world, we are on the crest of the latest wave of COVID. Indeed, various people in my village have had it just over the last couple of weeks. Not me so far, like Tony Curtis in The Great Race, wandering untouched through a hail of custard pies. Mind you, eventually, well, you know. But the point is, the country is now following the exact approach I suggested then, just through boredom with it all as much as by a policy choice. We simply stopped fixating on it as a huge deal. Are some people still ending up in hospital and dying? Well, yes, of course, that is sadly part of life. It was before and it will be forever after. And I don't underplay the personal tragedy that it is for each of those individuals concerned. But what changed? Did COVID change? To a point, but not importantly, what changed was our attitude. So why don't we embrace more of that attitude earlier, maybe even in advance of the things arriving? I say it knowing full well I'm wasting my time. Like a binge eater who consoles themselves over their weight gain by eating more, our society is addicted to micro-fear. But it's always up to us as to whether we take them up on the invitation on regards our own approach. All right, my thanks as always to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Without your support, I simply could not spend the time that I do making these videos. I could not choose to take topics that may or may not find favour with YouTube when it comes to monetizing videos and all of the rest of it. And I would be tempted to then go chasing after the algorithm with all the clickbait titles, going more and more extreme into various topics, knowing that that's what gave the best return. We don't do any of that here. We laugh in the face of the algorithm. You only have to look at how slowly the channel grows in order to see the veracity of that. Can only do any of that thanks to that very important group at Patreon. If you would like to join them in supporting the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.